In today's video, we're gonna go over 5 easy ways to use nutrition to increase your stamina on the basketball court without actually changing anything you're doing inside of your training. Usually whenever basketball players are looking at ways to improve their stamina, improve their conditioning, get in better game shape, their mind immediately turns to training. And yes, training is extremely important. It's pretty obvious at this point that if you're not training enough or you're doing the wrong type of training, that's gonna impact your performance quite a bit, and impact your stamina quite a bit on the basketball court. But a really underrated aspect of stamina on the basketball court is the food that you eat and your nutrition. And the fuel you put in your body, or the lack of it, can really impact the way you perform and impact your stamina and how well you perform, especially as you get later into games, later into workouts. And oftentimes skills won't even be what limit you later in games. It's more often your physical ability. Like if you don't have the legs in your jumper, if you can't keep up with your man on defense, if you don't have the fuel in the fuel tank to keep going in those later stages of workouts, your reps are not going to be as sharp. And obviously in games, if you want any chance of being clutch and being your team's go-to guy in late game situations, you need to be fueled properly to keep your composure and actually perform well in those situations. So what I want to do today is give you 5 easy ways to improve that and improve your stamina without changing your training at all, like I said in the intro. The first one of these 5 things is simply eating enough calories overall. I harp on this all the time, and in nearly every video I've talked about this to some extent because it is extremely important. If you're going into your training session or you're going into a game without eating enough total calories, you're simply going into it with your gas tank half empty, and you're gonna fatigue a lot more quickly, and that fatigue is going to affect your performance. You're gonna get sloppy later in games, later in workouts. So one of the simplest things you can do, without getting into all the fancy strategies and supplementation we'll talk about later, is simply eating enough food. So now the next question after that might be, how do I figure out what my maintenance is? How do I figure out what a caloric surplus is? And I've done a few videos on this topic, but in general, there are a number of calculators online. The one I use with my clients is called the Harris-Benedict equation. That one is going to tell you what your maintenance is. If your goal is to not really gain any weight, that should give you a pretty good idea of what your calorie needs are. And if you want to maybe gain some muscle, then you'll want to take that number it spits out and add 300 to 500 calories to that. Obviously, those are very general recommendations, and it's going to depend on the individual situation. So again, if you need help with this, please comment down below and I'll help with your individual situation. But that should give you a pretty good starting point when it comes to your calorie needs. And like I said, that's the single biggest thing you can do when you're looking at improving your stamina. And a lot of basketball players simply are not eating enough to begin with. I can probably count on one hand the amount of basketball players I've worked with personally that have actually initially been eating enough when we started working together. So I'd highly recommend you start here. Now, once you have the calories dialed in, once you're like, okay, I'm eating enough, I'm at maintenance, what's the next step from there? What's another thing I can do? Number 2 on our list of 5 is to make sure you're eating enough carbohydrates. So calories is like the baseline fundamental level of how you fuel yourself. On top of that, we have macronutrients. There's 3 of them: proteins, carbs, and fats. The one I'm highlighting right now is carbohydrates because carbs are your body's primary source of fuel for high intensity activity. So if you're going into a high intensity workout or a game where you're really going to be pushing yourself, carbs are going to be mostly what's fueling that. Fat fuels it to some extent, but at higher intensities, carbohydrate is a much more effective fuel source. So not only do we need to make sure you're eating enough calories, we need to make sure you're eating enough of the right type of calories. So this is why going on a low carb diet is usually not very helpful. I did a video on the ketogenic diet here on the channel as well. And it's why restricting that food group, like whole grains, sweet potatoes, white potatoes, foods like that, cutting those out of your diet because you think carbs are bad for you, like, or whatever you saw on social media, is actually going to hurt your performance quite a bit. So I would not recommend following a low carb diet. And in general, following a pretty moderate, if not high carbohydrate diet as an athlete is very important for making sure you're fueling for performance. In general, the International Society of Sports Nutrition recommends about 5 to 7 grams of carbohydrates per kilogram of body weight per day. So for example, if you're 100 kilograms, which is about 220 pounds, you'd be looking at consuming about 500 to 700 grams of carbohydrates a day to really maximize performance. And obviously it's quite a big range, so you're gonna wanna test and assess there to find out what really works best for you. Now, moving on to number 3 on the list, we have do not go into your workout dehydrated. Hydration is one of those really simple things that affects your performance a lot, and it's super simple to take care of. I can't believe how easy it is, but many hoopers don't take care of it. They just simply ignore it, or they don't like water, or they think they're drinking enough, but they're actually far underhydrating. And it's been proven time and time again in the research, both physically and mentally, hydration has negative performance impacts. And when it comes to stamina and keeping you performing at your best, both physically and mentally, like I said, hydration is extremely important. So that's another thing I would recommend. It's super simple, and when you take care of it, you'll notice differences right away. Now, how much water should you drink? I have a couple videos on this as well, but just to keep it short here, take your body weight, divide that by 2. So for example, 200 pounds, divide that by 2, 100 ounces of water. That's how many ounces of water you should be drinking. And then for every hour of physical activity, you're gonna wanna add another 15 to 20 ounces on top of that. And a really easy way to make sure you're staying hydrated is to look at your pee. Like if you're peeing and it's super dark, you're probably not hydrated enough. And if you're peeing and it's like crystal clear, like it looks just like straight water, you're probably overhydrating a little bit. A good but weird way to remember this is it should be light like lemonade. I know it's kind of weird, but it gets the job done. So that's a really easy way to make sure you're hydrated. And as bonus points, you can add some electrolytes if you're a salty sweater or you know that you're losing a lot of electrolytes and maybe you're training in the heat or something like that. That can also be something you consider. But overall, hydration is important. I have multiple videos on the channel going over how to stay hydrated, your hydration goals, all that stuff. Now, moving on to item number 4 on the list of how to improve your stamina without changing your training at all comes fueling during training. So now that I think about it, this probably should have been number 3 because it builds pretty nicely off of number 2, but forgive me. Nonetheless, it is important and it's something to consider, especially if you're training for long durations and or at high intensities. So if you're training for longer than 45 minutes to an hour, especially longer than 90 minutes, and it's high intensity, so let's say you have a really hard practice or you have a game and you play a lot of minutes for your team, you'll really want to consider fueling during your training and using things like sports drinks. And since posting that video about sports drinks here on the channel, it actually came to my attention, one of my friends who used to be a sports dietitian for some professional baseball teams brought to my attention that when choosing between things like Gatorade or Body Armor, at first I said it's more of a preference thing, and overall I think it is, but if you're really trying to optimize that, I would go with Gatorade because according to him, the mineral profile in Gatorade is better than the mineral profile in something like Body Armor or Powerade or something like that. So as of right now, I would probably recommend going with Gatorade. That could change in the future, but that would be my recommendation there as far as sports drinks. And that should help keep you fueled during your training if it's longer or more intense. And then the next thing we have on our list of ways to improve stamina, and this is kind of getting towards the top of the pyramid, those things that are gonna help a little bit, but not gonna really make or break anything. We have supplementation. Like I said, it's the top of the pyramid. So I would highly recommend getting your calorie intake dialed in, getting your carbohydrate intake dialed in, getting your hydration dialed in, and even getting your intra-workout fueling dialed in first before pursuing this. But evidence-based supplementation can be a good way to kind of squeeze out an extra 1 to 5% of your performance during intense workouts in situations where you really want to maximize that. And 2 supplements that do seem to show some promise when it comes to this side of things is creatine. That's going to help regenerate energy when it comes to those short high intensity bursts. So for example, a good way to illustrate the effects of creatine is you take 2 sprinters running a 100-yard dash, and one sprinter who's not taking creatine, one sprinter who is. The sprinter who is on that 6th, 7th, 8th attempt is going to be able to run faster or regenerate energy between those successive sprints more effectively than that sprinter who's not on creatine, assuming that he's responding well to it. Some people are non-responders. I have a video about this on the channel too. So that is one supplement that could potentially show some promise there. Another one for those more intermediate length sort of situations is beta-alanine, and that's gonna help to improve endurance again in those medium length situations. So as a basketball player, you find yourself in those a lot where you're kind of not super quick and explosive, but not a long, drawn out, low intensity situation. You're kind of in that gray middle ground where you're still glycolytic, but you're not really pushing it to that highest level. Beta-alanine is going to help buffer hydrogen ion production. It's a key player in the synthesis of the actual molecule that does that. So that's gonna help in that sort of situation. And again, it's not gonna make or break anything. So if you can't do that, don't stress over it. But it could be something if you have all those other things dialed in, if you want to take it to that next level and really optimize everything, it could be something to consider. Now, my question for you today is which one of these 5 things are you going to implement right now? Because it's super important that after watching this video, you actually implement what we're talking about so you actually improve your performance and improve your stamina on the court. And I'm gonna put a couple videos up on the screen right now, one going over hydration and one going over creatine, two really well-performing videos on the channel that relate to what we're talking about, so you'll enjoy those. And click on that on the screen right now, and I will see you in those next videos.